About 2 hours outside of Pittsburgh is the town of Punxsutawney. This coal town is the home of a certain groundhog named Phil, who, as legend has it, has a knack for predicting the weather. And so every February 2nd since 1886, Punxsutawney Phil emerges from his stump up on Gobbler's Knob, and if he sees his shadow, we get another 6 weeks of winter. So as we heard from Jason, we're screwed. But it was on February 2nd, 1993, that Punxsutawney Phil also emerged from his stump, saw his shadow. And for visiting weatherman Phil Connors, things went downhill from there. 1993, that was the year one of my favorite films, Groundhog Day, was released. As many of you recall, the film follows the journey of hapless weatherman Phil Connors, played by actor Bill Murray, as he trudges his way through February 2nd. And since Phil's story feels oddly fitting for our peculiar circumstances today, I figured we could spend some time there today. If you've not seen the movie, I am going to spoil it for you. It's been 32 years, so I don't really feel too bad about it. But if you haven't seen it or haven't seen it in a while, I still recommend checking it out. Like many movies from that time, however, just be aware it clearly has issues and accept my apologies in advance. I should also note that most of it, however, was filmed like an hour north of us in Woodstock, Illinois, so that's pretty fun. My family and I watched this movie in preparation for this sermon, and I got to call it homework. How awesome is that? Living the life. Anyway, so let's talk about Phil Connors. While we never really learn his age, we do know that his emotional development seems to have stalled out somewhere on his path to maturity. Phil, as we find him, is smug, self-absorbed, and petty. During his visit to Punxsutawney, where his team is in town to do a feel-good story, to meet the locals, interview the mayor, and generally ham it up for the camera, Phil shows some clear disdain for his coworkers, for his job, for the town of Punxsutawney, and the people of Punxsutawney. In short, he acts like a complete jerk, and it's clear that he cannot wait to get out of town. But as fate would have it, a surprise snowstorm hits the town, cuts off major highway travel, and downs all long-distance telephone lines in or out of the area. Anyone remember long-distance telephone lines? Okay. So poor Phil and his team are trapped overnight. The next morning, he wakes up to find that it is inexplicably Groundhog Day once again. He's pretty sure everyone is pranking him at first, and he quickly realizes, however, that no one notices that the day is on repeat. Only Phil. He wanders through the day completely befuddled, gets snowed in again, goes to bed again, wakes up again, and it's Groundhog Day all over again. Phil panics, and over the course of successive Groundhog Days, Phil tries to see how far he can push things. He lies, he cheats, he seduces, he robs a bank. He attempts to escape by train, by plane, by automobile. He tries to call someone, anyone out of town to let them know he's trapped. He attempts to murder Punxsutawney Phil. But no matter what he gets away with or does not get away with, the next morning is always February 2nd. Again, and again, and again. In one scene, Phil heads to a bar and asks, "What would you do if you were stuck in one place and every day was exactly the same and nothing that you did mattered?" His new friend replies, quote, "Well, that about sums it up for me." It is a laugh line, right? It's supposed to be a laugh line in the movie. But I also think that may be one of the saddest things I've ever heard. We don't need a time loop to be so thoroughly stuck, robbed of agency, of power, that we can come to a place where meaning itself is lost. That was the pandemic. It's a nightmare. Some of you point to the news of the day, today, and ask, can I wake up from that? Trust me when I say that about sums it up for me, too. At some point in our time together, I've given sermons where I talk about writing the stories of our lives. Raise your hand if you remember one of these stories. Yeah, okay, fine, thank you. Your $20 will be in the mail. Now, I've suggested that we should imagine ourselves novelists with our own lives as the text, where the point is to write something that you would enthusiastically recommend to others. Enthusiastically recommend. Admittedly, this is a bit dramatic, but I think the point is relatively clear. And it's not unreasonable to say that if we are the author of our own lives, then we always have at least some agency. Maybe not a lot, but some. And when we start with some, perhaps we can go on to claim more. That's my hope. Now, I wrote out the first version of that sermon years ago, long before anyone had ever heard the words novel coronavirus. And because of my pandemic experience, the meaning behind my idea of enthusiastically recommending life as a novel that we write, my meaning is a little different today. I remember during the pandemic, in my very first few months here, trying to claim a bit of agency every week. But do you know how weird it is to work all week long on a joke, then finally get to tell it and have no response, no feedback, nothing whatsoever? It's awful. So when Phil said, quote, I wake up every day right here, right in Punxsutawney, and it's always February 2nd, and there's nothing I can do about it. That made sense to me back then, because I had this same sense of stuckness. It's a feeling I suspect many of you have had too. Maybe you've had that feeling recently, maybe even had it today. Scanning the news, a mere 2 weeks into a brand new government administration, there is so much noise and drama coming out of Washington, D.C., that even if Saturday Night Live really wanted to, they would have both a hard time distracting you or making up stories more ridiculous. DEI causes plane crashes. Pardoning insurrectionists makes America great. Can someone tell me in simple sentences how an anti-vaxxer is supposed to prevent the next pandemic? That would be great. Or how renaming the Gulf of Mexico, purchasing Greenland from Denmark, or invading Panama are even remotely relevant to the price of eggs. I would love any of that. Feel free to put it in my mailbox. But the list of recent nonsense we're being asked to take seriously is mind-boggling. Maybe the worst part about all of this, the deja vu. Because we've been here before. It wasn't fun the first time. Everyone had a long list of complaints, and yet here we go again. It's Groundhog Day! That brings me back to the movie. I think a lot of us here today can relate to poor old Phil stuck in his time loop and lament right along with him when he said, quote, what if there is no tomorrow because there wasn't one today? In Groundhog Day, there was no escape for Phil. He was well and thoroughly trapped. No amount of weaseling, conniving, plotting, or begging would flip the clock forward into February 3rd. Every tomorrow was just another today, endlessly. And that's also us, isn't it? No amount of begging, bargaining, justifying, or raging is going to flip the clock forward 4 years. We're stuck. Now, unlike Phil, we do have agency. Our actions today, collectively and individually, directly impact how long this phase of American idiocracy will last and what it will look like. The more you resist, the more you refuse to give up, the more you engage, the more you fail to retreat, the harder it will be to dismantle our communities, our institutions, and our shared vision for a better tomorrow. Yes, there will be damage. But together, I believe we can make it out. And yes, I do believe that with my whole heart. But that day when things are better is not today. That day is one of our tomorrows. So when will tomorrow be today? For Phil, February 3rd was only a dream. And as the movie progresses, we can see that knowledge wear him down. However, there's also a point where he seems to give in. Not give up, give in. At some point, he seems to realize that his little pocket universe isn't going to change on its own. So he chooses to change it. And he does this knowing completely that his little changes won't matter. He knows that the next day is still going to be Groundhog Day and everything will be right back the way it was. But for Phil, it stops mattering that nothing matters. And that's exactly when something amazing happens. It's as if he slowly realizes, it just slowly dawns on him that the people around him are real, that they really matter. And so, over time, and almost by accident, Phil gets to know them and learn their stories. And then he starts to change them. Why does he do this? Well, at first, it looks like it's because he can. He's just unfathomably bored. He knows what's going to happen because literally he's seen it happen before. And so when Phil discovers that a homeless man has frozen to death, he decides to take it personally. He figures out exactly what he needs to do and when in order to help that man avoid his fate. And that's what he does every day from that day forward. How about the man choking over a dinner? The first time it happens, Phil couldn't save him. So the next day, he learns the Heimlich maneuver and uses it to save him that night. The kid falling out of the tree. Phil adds an afternoon walk so that he can be there every day to catch him. The group of retirees with a flat tire. Phil is now Johnny on the spot, ready with a jack, the perfect spare tire, and the skills of an indie pit boss. The movie gives us this sense that these are just a few of the myriad interventions that Phil uses to build his life, his Groundhog Day life. Helping becomes a reflex. It's a routine. By the end of the movie, these are his errands. Every day, Phil moves through the town like a minor god, making positive change for no other reason than the simple joy that he can. There's a scene where the hotel bartender says, "Sometimes, Phil, the only way out is through." Yeah, now, a little side note, because I think it's easy to miss this in the movie. There's an example that Phil is showing his skill at card tossing. A coworker who knows the old Phil happens to be terrible at tossing cards into a hat, sits up when he sees the new Phil suddenly showing off wicked skill. Phil shrugs and says, quote, "A few hours a day over a few months and you'd be surprised what you can learn to do." It's a flippant comment, but telling. According to author Malcolm Gladwell, you need time to get good at a thing. To get great at a thing, 10,000 hours of practice. It's a reasonable guess. So if you want to master jazz piano, ice sculpture, French, Russian literature, or any of the 1,000 things that Phil got great at during his time reliving his Groundhog Day. To do those things, to get great at them, requires practice. And that means we can make a reasonable guess as to how long Phil has been trapped in Punxsutawney. The answer, according to the internet, over 40 years. Yeah. So just in case you're wondering about the analogy I might be building here, because yes, I am seeing some parallels to this movie in our situation today. So just let me be clear. I am not saying we're going to be trapped in a post-Trump, post-truth era for 40 years. I'm also not saying the best way to cope with our time of trouble is to learn card tossing, jazz piano, ice sculpture, French, or Russian literature. Though those would be fun. What am I saying? What I'm saying is just this. Sometimes the only way out is through. When things changed for Phil Connors, what I believe is what finally broke him out of his time prison was love. What we are meant to discover by the end of the movie is that our boy Phil has fallen in love with the town of Punxsutawney and everyone in it. He allowed them into his bubble. And not only has he made himself a part of their lives and their stories, but he also allowed them to become his story, too. But perhaps the most surprising thing of all is that, for Phil at least, love is not a feeling. Not a feeling. It's something more. In Groundhog Day, we see selfishness become outrage, outrage become despair, despair become resignation, resignation become acceptance, acceptance become awareness, awareness become empathy, empathy gave way to compassion. And when compassion became practice, tomorrow became today. Let me repeat that. When compassion becomes practice, tomorrow becomes today. When compassion becomes our great work, when aspiration becomes perspiration, when love becomes more than a feeling, when love becomes our practice, when love becomes not just a way of living, but living itself, that's the day that beloved community is born. That's when tomorrow becomes today. And that story, I want to say that if that was our novel, the story of our lives, that would be a novel we would all recommend. So as I turn to the close, let me offer this final thought. We learned some things during the pandemic. 5 years ago, back when I delivered the first version of this sermon, that I am now reprising in my own little Groundhog Day game. Feel free to go back and check the archives. It's totally there. Back then, we were exhausted, demoralized, frightened, separated, and isolated. We were stuck. We know now that what we needed then was to be together. The old South African saying, Ubuntu, comes to mind. I am because you are. I am because you are. Because we are only human together. In a not entirely unexpected plot twist, Timothy Snyder, author of the book on tyranny, a book we've been delving into repeatedly these last few months, Snyder happens to agree. When dehumanization, isolation, and exhaustion are the tools being used by the forces of oppression, being human, that is, being together, is an act of defiance. Being together is an act of defiance. So keep showing up, you little rebel you. Here in church, on every social media platform, everyone, even those owned by oligarchs, and in the public square, with your signs, with your shirts, with your voices. As my wife, the Reverend Julia Jones, taught me, quote, do it even if you are not personally affected. Do it because there are people more afraid than you are. Do it because there are people more directly affected and affected in ways they fear they may not recover from. Resisting requires you to connect and be heard in their interest. Holding off tyranny does not allow us to withdraw to the comfort of our shaded windows and our online streaming services. To live according to our shared values, we must have a firm grasp on our place in the public square, places where our beloveds are under threat. To be with those facing economic hardship, to be with those who do not have a social, economic, or political cushion. We must show up and be in love with the people who need us if we want to break this endless cycle of nonsense. So show up for love. Show up and be love. Show up and let love be the action. Love as a practice where every day we learn that there is plenty of places to practice. And maybe this is our key too. If the noise out of Washington is one more lock on the door keeping us out of our future, then just as it was for Phil, maybe our only way out is through. And wherever we are, individually, right now, today, it's when we stop collectively pretending that it is someone else that needs to do the thing and not us. When our actions become more about everyone around us than about us. When we make compassion our daily practice, that is exactly when our clocks tick forward. As poet laureate Amanda Gorman once told us, there will always be light so long as we are brave enough to be it. Be the light, my friends. It's a beautiful day to be the light. So for now, I'll give the final word to Phil. He said, quote, "When Chekhov saw the long winter, he saw a winter bleak and dark and bereft of hope. Yet we know that winter is just another step in the cycle of life. But standing here among the people of UUSG and basking in the warmth of their hearths and hearts, I couldn't imagine a better fate than a long and lustrous winter. I love you."
Visit us at uusg.org.